Kumela Daxel Ocheni Salbona Nda Tobela Molo Avusheni. Hello, and welcome to this conversation on unlocking the power of local data, brought to you by the Redzone in discussion with M&C Saatchi Group South Africa this afternoon, really bringing together industry titans. Right now, we're asking, in this globalized world, how do you unlock the power of local data? And helping us answer this big question is the CEO at Takealot Group, Mamongae Mahlare, CEO of 8020, Steve Burnstone, co-founder and CSO at M&C Saatchi Group South Africa, Robert Grace, and founding director at ovatoyou, Amanda Reekie, who this morning will offer invaluable perspectives that elevate your strategies and maximize insight. And it's starting right now. I'm Arya Kelman, MD of Tilt, and I'll be taking all your questions in the live chat as we start the conversation. But let's get straight into it. And Mamongae, I'm going to start with you because you know the most about me. You know that I bought a dehumidifier last week. You know the home address that I often order Mr. D to. You know which bank I'm with, which loyalty program. You know a lot of data about me. And perhaps in a conversation around data, the best thing to do at the start of that conversation is to say perhaps where we don't want the conversation to go, because it's become such a buzzword, a little bit of a cliche in and of itself. So a conversation on data in 2023 in August, where should we try not to go this afternoon?
Hi, Aria, and it's wonderful to be here. What is important is that we do not talk in general terms and be academic about it. I think it's about being practical and also being open-minded around, the different perspectives that you can go at this from.
Robert, there's lots of different perspectives. What are some of the cautionary tales we should be telling at the start of this chat?
I mean, I guess I'm reminded of a quote from Bill Gates where he talks about data and he says, the best way to put distance between yourself and your competitor is to do an outstanding job with data, and the emphasis on the word do. And I think that talks to what Mamongae was talking about, what's practical, what's tangible. And I think the important thing is how your teams understand it and how they act on it. So yeah, I think it's less about the good old kind of cliche of data is important and how we use it. I think it's actually about getting into the practical application of it. And I hope we cover some of that off in the chat today.
And Steve, just building on that, because in our discussion yesterday, you were emphatic around this conversation, having hard takeaways and real-time insights. But perhaps there's a little bit of sort of, a sentiment of people are a little scared of data. So maybe just put everyone at ease around the conversation as well, in terms of where we don't want to go and why we should even be discussing it in the first place and why not to be afraid of it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think first off, I think maybe as marketers or in the marketing space, for a number of years, I think data has sort of almost been seen as a topic that's sort of out of reach or possibly not within the sort of marketer's skill set, and I think that's definitely not the case. I remember speaking to one of the large sort of global hospitality brands in 2009, and the theme there was the new normal, and we were talking about concepts like big data and machine learning that had only just started, really. And here we are 14 odd years later. Feels like we're using those same terms, same cliches, but in a world where, the pace at which we are needing to adopt some of these new techniques, these new technologies, ways of thinking about the problem, are increasing exponentially. I think particularly in a market like South Africa. I mean, I was just speaking to a couple of clients this week, and the theme was consistent. It was around, we really need to be using our data better. Why? Primarily because growth is harder to come by. I think like in a post-COVID, there's a whole bunch of different things we can get into later, but in the current environment, data really, I think to Robert, your point, data really presents an opportunity to differentiate yourself, and the way you use it, can really lead to sustained success.
And Amanda, just closing out our opening remarks, where we don't want to go this afternoon.
I was going to say something a bit controversial in a way, in that data per se is not necessarily as important as the the layers that you add on top of the data and the time that the business takes to make sense of that data in their, so that for me is a much bigger thing than having the data. And in some ways, a lot of organizations have access to similar levels of data, but it's I think we're all saying the same thing in different ways, but it's how you interpret it, the time you spend on that, and then how you're able to action that within your business. That's going to be the differentiator.
And this is going to be a big theme for us in this discussion, this idea of taking data and turning it into information that forms part of some process in a marketing context that yields ROI and engages consumers, and ultimately, makes a business work. Robert, let's come to you because there's been a bit of this advent of the word data. It used to be like consumer research. That was kind of the word, and you would think like 10 people in a room discussing something. Now there's this word data. Data in a post-COVID world has become such a hot topic. That word is almost as overtraded as authenticity. But when we talk about this word data, what do we mean by data? And what's been the fire in the context of data in this post-COVID era that we're in?
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes back, and Steve said it, one of the things I love about my job is I get to work across a broad range of clients in different sectors, across different wingspans of target audiences. And, there's one simple question that everybody's asking is, where will growth come from? And with that context, I think the appreciation of data, or actually probably the lack thereof, is front and center of that conversation. And, I think where it comes from is that if we take the pandemic, you have to mention it, but that's because I think for 2 to 3 years, we were all forced into a world of being highly responsive, highly tactical, highly agile. But as that settles, I think we realize that isn't sustainable. And that isn't where sustained success is going to come from. And I guess it's this, to use the analogy, if you want to build a skyscraper, we've got to dig those deep foundations. And certainly what we're seeing is, I guess, this great reappraisal moment. And the three things that I think are the fundamentals of those foundations are, do you have the most precise positioning possible in the market? Do you understand what you're famous for? What do your value propositions really mean in customers' lives? And then how are you going to accelerate demand with your marketing spend? And I think all of those three areas actually need diverse sets of data coming together. And then I think, as Amanda was saying, what are we layering on top of it? And then to Mamongae's point is that, we all have limited budgets, priorities, timelines. What do you choose? What do you focus on? Because it can get, I guess, a bit overwhelming.
Precise positioning, equity, and demand. Mamongae, in your context at the Takealot Group, you've got so much of this data. I mean, you've probably got far too much of this data. And it's that process of taking it from data and turning it into something, and that human touch of taking that and building it into a context of precise positioning, equity, demand, having opinions on these things. How do you go about taking all this data and turning it into something that's truly tangible and putting it into those three buckets that Robert was speaking about?
Yeah, so Aria, first of all, there is never such a world as too much data. I think we can always know more. So next time I'll try and find out even more about you. So I think from a Takealot Group perspective, it's always around starting first with the strategic question you're really trying to answer, right? Because for data to become insights, you need to be applying it to a clear question that you're trying to answer. And so given that our disposition is about consumer centricity, we're always trying to understand how we can improve the service that we provide to our customers. So a lot of times it's around really understanding the customers better, evaluating whether or not there are opportunities for improved selection. Is there opportunities for improved pricing? Are there opportunities in terms of how you communicate to those target segments? Because we are still in a stage where there's a lot of education around e-commerce, etc., which is quite an important aspect. So in terms of some of the examples of how you can really see this coming to life is thinking about even load shedding. We all experience it and we all take it for granted that our data point in our experience extrapolates to the entire South Africa. And therefore, your initial strategy in terms of going to market with your selection may have a certain bias in terms of what you're offering. But when you have a better understanding of your target customers, like we have used a lot of this data to help us define more clearly, is that we then started to realize that, you know, certain segments were being overserved, and then there were certain segments that needed to have offerings that were tailored towards their needs, and therefore we started to really make sure that our selection really addresses that. And when you take it to the Superbalist example, which is our fashion business, there is a significant portion of our segments that are young, vibrant, and fashion forward. What they are looking for is completely different to you know, your more mature customers that is looking for more classical selection. So you do have to be able to understand, first of all, who your customers are and how do you serve them appropriately. So when I'm speaking to the fashion forward, those are the guys that will be far more interested in the collabs that we would do with young upcoming designers or popular artists, etc. You know, and they would be far more receptive to that, especially if you engage with them on Instagram. And you follow that through into their world. Very different strategy when I'm trying to, you know, sell a classical suit, for example, and or speak to a more, you know, mature customer looking for a classical look. And so it is essential that you are clear about what are the key questions I'm trying to ask, who are my customers, and how do I think about the totality of my communication with them so that I also speak to them using relevant touch points.
Steve, I can see that you want to build on this. I mean, when Mamongae speaks about it, it seems like such obvious questions to ask, but then in reality, and you'd have a better sort of understanding of the broader industry than what potentially I would or the audience would, it's not really happening. So maybe just building on some of these basics that we've been chatting about thus far.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think first off, you know, back to one of your earlier questions, just around sort of, you know, let's not be afraid of data. It's maybe worth sort of unpacking. So what do we mean by, you know, that term data? And you know, I think, Mamongae, some of your sort of use cases or examples. I mean, we're talking about, you know, first party data. So how are we using, you know, our transactional data? How, as an organization, how are you using your transactional data? How are you sort of understanding, you know, from, you know, the customer data that you're capturing, maybe online, your web analytics, whatever it might be. How are you, you know, how are you sort of best using that information? And then another data set that's super important is, you know, just your business performance. So how do you understand the relationship between, you know, an individual customer and the profitability or the performance, you know, from a financial perspective of that customer, because that gives you a really valuable sort of internal view of sort of transactionally what products people might be buying, but then also from a sort of bottom line perspective, what does that actually mean for your long-term, you know, customer lifetime value or whatever metrics you might be looking at. And then I think the third aspect, which really has been sort of, you know, a puzzle for years, is this aspect of external data. So it's the, you know, it's the market research, it's the brand tracker analysis, your panel research, your secondary data sets, and how do those data sets also then get incorporated so that you have this holistic view of your business, or of your customers, your business's performance, overlaid with a strong understanding of the market. And I think, you know, what we are seeing, you know, in the industry is, you know, attempts to combine those data sets to make sure that we're almost speaking with one voice when we come up with our strategies, be they marketing briefs for campaigns, or like Mamongae, you were saying, be they sort of your targeted marketing, through the algorithms that sit inside your app.
It feels like a good point, building on what you've been chatting about, Steve, to Amanda, chat a little around taking this data and visualizing it and socializing it and building some sort of a context and an ecosystem within which to look at it versus just walking into a room and having all these different things and directions that you could go. So bringing it back to some of these kind of textbook fundamentals, when we speak about visualizing and socializing all these different data sets and inputs, what does that mean? Because that's possibly a really practical tool that we can take away from this conversation in terms of taking something that's just a lump of stuff and turning it into something that's valuable and has efficiency.
Yeah, I think even before that, though, I want to talk to something that's often overlooked in this space, and that's the context that so Mamongae spoke about understanding the people's life and how they live, and how one of the things that we do is we actually get people to upload, for argument's sake, and we did it for your predecessor, Spree, pictures of their wardrobe or their hardest working item in their wardrobe with why. So sometimes data, which is in essence, as you said, transactional data, needs another layer or context. And sometimes that is good old immersion and insight that comes from, primary research answering a very specific question. And then with respect to the visualization and the socialization, it's a real big point of mine, because I think a lot of organizations are sitting on a lot of transactional data. They actually do have a fair sense of who's buying what, where they're living, etc., especially if they're working with the 80-20. But sometimes what they're unable to do is to communicate this properly in the business so that it becomes knowledge that everybody can apply in decision making. And I think that's a big passion point of mine, is trying to get, I call it socialized data, socialized insight, socialized, so that whoever's working on the ground can actually apply that knowledge in their day-to-day decisions.
Open plan offices and the power of speaking to others in the organization. Robert, I know you want to build on what Amanda's been speaking about.
I was just going to say, I think, Amanda, this idea of context is so important, and data is going to give you, that insight, that observation, but it's what you put on top of it. And, just a recent example, I won't mention the brand, but we've recently done some work for one of the biggest wine brands in the country. And the data point that actually revealed so much for us was actually just website traffic, as simple as something like that. Because what we saw was a spike in traffic Monday to Friday between 9 and 11, predominantly going to either the online portal to go and shop, or potentially going to details around the estate to visit it. But then there was another spike, and that was on a Friday and a Saturday between 6 and 8 p.m. And you start thinking, well, why that? What's happening? And you start going, well, it's actually quite obvious when you start thinking about it. And you go, where are people at? They're either in the wine aisle or they're in a restaurant trying to impress or buy the right wine, because most people don't know a lot about wine. And so they're going online to search. And now what's so interesting is you go, okay, so now what does that mean for the kind of performance marketing that I'm going to be doing now during the week versus those peak times? What sort of messaging do I need to put there? Friday and Saturday I might be talking about awards and kind of romancing the liquid versus what I'm going to do during Monday to Friday with deals and promos, for instance. So I think that idea of context is such an important one. I think the power is in joining dots. And I think that, to Amanda's point, that actually means spending a bit of time thinking it through.
Joining dots and thinking it through. We are live, and there are a lot of questions coming through on the live chat. There is someone that feels very neglected in this conversation thus far, and that is the human gut instinct. This is a question coming through in the live chat, which says, how can you maintain a human-centric approach when applying a gut-based analysis to challenges? And Mamongae, I'm going to direct this one to you, because I see a lot of Takealot collateral that makes me feel something that, there's a load shedding series that you guys have recently done that you can't tell me that you did a data thing that figured out that that's what the creative storyboard for that ad should be, unless you really are doing that kind of thing. But there is this idea of kind of, human gut instinct, and does it still play a role? Are we in this era of sort of mad men and mad maths, and the two of them coming together? And how do you incorporate gut?
I think that's an important question. First of all, you do need to apply, data to be able to understand the context, the customer, the environment. And that's where great insights actually germinate out of, right? And so I think also the important thing is, when we talk about my gut instinct, well, gut instinct actually is your body of knowledge and data that has now become quite automatic in your head and mind, right? So that's why you see people that are experienced in a certain area that will just feel their way, where it just feels like they can just sense that these numbers don't look right. I don't know what it is, but they're not right. Or this communication is not going to speak to the target market. It's just missing it somehow. So I think gut instinct is your own internal data that you have processed and developed good indications that help you navigate it. So what is important, though, is it raises the sense of humanity and data, which is saying that look at the data, look at what it's telling you, and contextualize it, and then also step away from it and look at it from, from the top down, to say, okay, what's, from a human point of view, what's going to be relevant here, right? And that's really one of the most challenging part, particularly when it comes to marketing and communication executions, is how do you just develop that, what feels like a sixth sense, once you've absorbed all this data, and be able to say, I think that direction is going to be far more relevant than this direction. And that's judgment. And you can't always put data to that touch and that nuance. And that just comes from, I guess.
Mamongae, could I challenge you there a little bit? I mean, it'll be nice to have a conversation on that, because that is something I'm super passionate about. I've got a friend of mine who's a management consultant, and he did his PhD on this whole issue of cognitive bias. And the piece of research was really, I mean, cognitive bias is quite a broad topic, but he was specifically looking at overconfidence of executive management, again, within sort of the US, top 500 listed entities. And his research sort of said that management teams that display attributes of overconfidence, or you might say sort of a bit of hubris, or a stronger sense of intuition, the performance on average across those kind of businesses, they would be, the value of those businesses over the long term was reduced by 30%. So there was this sort of, there's this, I think the point there is this dichotomy where, to your point, I mean, you see a set of numbers and 100%, you're like, hey, I think, something's wrong here, versus sort of making strategic decisions that are not sort of fact-based. And I mean, it'll be interesting to know how you encourage your team, to make sure they sort of have, chats with facts, and to make sure that like you don't sort of step into this sort of error of saying, hey, that's a fantastic idea. It sounds great. Everyone's excited by the angle. But when you actually look at, the market, or you look at the data, you realize, hold on, there's a gap between the idea and really where value is sitting. And maybe we could be just applying a bit of like hubris, and not good sort of fact-based decision making.
Yeah. So I guess the point of departure is where I started off by saying that you process the data. Gut feel at the end of the day, which was the question, was around like, is gut feel data free? And my point of view is it's not. It actually is internalized data, right?
Yeah.
And there's also always a point. Data can take you so far, and in certain areas, particularly in uncharted territories or in creative spaces, where you are dealing with also the human element or the unknown, judgment is going to say, how do I take this data and what it's telling me, and do I move in direction A or B, which is going to be the best one? It still requires that you be data-led. But data, if it tells you a precise singular answer, I think then you're probably actually looking at the data in a biased way. It should not in all circumstances is it going to be precise, and there's only one path to take. Usually it's not. And you have to make sure that you use, I guess, judgment, the so-called gut, and
in that context.
Yeah.
Robert, I can see you itching to jump in.
There's this lovely phrase that goes, don't give me the facts, tell me the truth. And I think sometimes we do just hook onto one fact and we obsess over it and we attribute things to it. In Cannes this year, there was a lot of talk around what they call the Adidas wake up, where Adidas did accidentally and didn't know that they turned off their paid search in South America for a good couple of weeks or months, and nothing happened to sales. So that's why they didn't discover it until somebody went in and saw, oh, we haven't actually been spending on our paid search, and yet nothing happened to sales. And so they went in and did a whole lot of attribution analysis to see what was actually going on. And they realized that actually 65% of their sales were attributed to brand building initiatives. And yet they're spending 77% on performance media. Now, I'm not saying performance media isn't important. I think it's got a very important role. But sometimes the narrow lens, and this is what the global media director went on to say, says it's not about the metrics, but the lens by which you're appreciating those metrics. And he said it forced them into a very short-term funnel. And so they got into the spiral that was almost self-fulfilling. And so I think for me, it is, how do you understand what you're actually achieving and what's driving that? And maybe just last point, Google, a couple of years back, and now Google, who, dare I say, might not even know more about us than Takealot, spoke about the 3 grand challenges of understanding this. And they said, the 3 grand challenges are incrementality, understanding true causality. Why is this behavior happening? The second one was saying, how do we measure long-term efforts and effects today? And the last one was unification, and saying, how do we combine different lenses, different data sets, different perspectives on it to try and understand it better? And they don't have that answer. I don't think there is any one answer. I think it's actually about every business and its audience and its strategy, and saying, let's keep that in mind. And I don't think you ever get to an end point on that. I think it's constantly evolving. And I guess that's either the frustration for some, maybe a CFO, but actually I find that incredibly exciting.
Yeah. And I think, Robert, if I just connect what you've said and circle back to the point we're discussing about gut, the question now is, if I am that Adidas marketing CFO or that marketing person, do I then go and switch off my paid search forever, right? How I make that decision is where you got to then apply, I guess, a level of judgment and insight, and also be able to say, what actually is the long-term view of this? And some of these things are not perfect science. I remember a couple of years ago, and lots of people that do market research probably see this fact, where you would do research and ask individuals, where have you heard about my product? And they will tell you, no, I saw it on TV, and you know what? That brand had never advertised on TV. But because of all the other touch points that they had interacted with, and TV being this big thing, so if it's coming to my mind, I must have really seen it on TV. So I think it's also kind of, in this world with lots of information coming at us, is it actually going to be a perfect science that tells you that, X% of your purchases come from people that have seen it on TV and X come from this, etc. If it was that perfect and simple, then everybody would have that formula. So I think it's directional and it is helpful. And you always have to be able to say, sometimes to go where others haven't gone, you got to do what you also haven't done before. So have an element of, aspiration, innovation, and risk that you take as you apply data to make sure that you are advancing and creating new paradigms instead of replicating the ones that are pre-existing and captured in data.
But also
Amanda,
maybe, sorry.
No, I'm coming to you anyway.
It sort of builds on that a little bit, is to say that everything we're talking about is saying, how do you bring data and data-driven decision-making into the organization? So part of it is you need to have a certain comfort level with talking about it, being able to share it when you found it, share insight, have a culture that's comfortable with data and bringing in different pieces of data wherever it comes from, and to make the time, in the organization to have those conversations, because it isn't an exact science, and there might be another perspective or another data point or insight that is the missing piece in understanding something in a specific market.
And there's a comment that's picking up on that's come through on the live chat, which is that despite the proliferation of technology, why are organizations struggling to use the data effectively? And Amanda, I guess what you're speaking about is the comfortability around data and people finding it sort of quite an intimidating thing to even venture into and figure out how it might add business value. Steve, let's talk for a second around sort of building out frameworks that make this thing less intimidating, and something that, is actually quite exciting, because there is so much power in unlocking exactly what the topic of this conversation is, which is unlocking the power of data.
Yeah, certainly. I think just sort of tagging on to the end of Amanda, your comment. So we do a lot of different things at 80/20. One of the things we do is we have a product that we call the Citizen Analyst Tool. And I'm an actuary, and most of the people here are, engineers or mathematicians or sort of have that bent. And we thought we had created, and we still think it's a fantastic tool. And essentially what it enables you to do, it enables you to slice and dice your internal first-party data sets, merged to some extent with external data sets, but without the need for, an MIS department or a BI department. So you could have an idea in the shower as a marketer and say, well, how many people have been shopping at my stores in the Western Cape and have this profile? And you immediately got an idea of, what revenue came from those kind of customers and what they look like, etc. The challenge, though, that we find is that encouraging our clients' employees or teams to use that tool is very challenging. And typically what we find is that rather than giving them access to the data, even if it's in a very sort of easy to use sort of tool, which the Citizen Analyst tool is, it's a sort of online sort of drag and drop kind of tool. Actually, what's more useful is helping to create the frameworks and the processes that enable the teams then to, in a consistent manner, sort of make strategic decisions, track how those decisions from a sort of execution perspective are performing, and then how to readjust. because I think, I mean, understandably, you know, when you do one piece of market research and then when you look at one piece of analysis from an internal analyst team, you know, you're always getting different pieces of insights that then are sort of bubbling to surface, you know, some other area of opportunity. And what we found is creating that framework to do that, and create a comfort zone almost for, you know, for brands, teams to say, hey, within the space, you know, we're able to sort of track performance, identify personas or particular segments that are under or overserved. And some of the ways that we've done that is through, you know, I spoke initially around sort of your first party data, your sort of business performance data, and the market research and external data. We sort of fuse that together in one of our solutions. I know there's a few others in the market, but trying to sort of create a holistic view of your customers against a sort of a market backdrop. And what we've done there is it's something called like the 80-20 national segmentation. And we've effectively profiled all South African adults into 1,500 micro segments, with a bunch of demographic and engagement and digital, you know, metrics that sit behind those profiles. We help our clients then match those profiles to their internal data and internal customers, to then, you know, identify where are those pockets of opportunity. So what does, you know, my most valuable customer look like? And have I possibly misunderstood the fact that, Amanda and Steve, you know, although we might spend the same amount of money and visit with the same frequency, you know, at a particular retailer, we're actually very different people, and we sit in different sort of micro segments, we sit in different profiles, and possibly there's a much bigger opportunity to speak to Amanda about different categories, and to create different brand associations, because there's much more headroom for people like Amanda than there are for Steve, who's spending at his max. And your share of wallet amongst that profile is sort of highly penetrated. And creating those frameworks and those tools then enable, you know, marketing teams. I know we've done work with M&C Saatchi, Robert, where, you know, even during the course of sort of doing that piece of work, you know, the digital teams and others are then able to say, hey, how do we actually sort of craft our sort of digital strategies to be way more effective around these sort of smaller sort of target segments, to drive specific behaviors, be it frequency, just brand association, etc.
Robert, picking up on exactly what Steve's been talking about here, there is a question on the live chat building on this, which is, what skills should I look at developing to truly understand and interpret data, especially when it comes to using the data to communicate a client's message? Obviously, the first skill is receptiveness to wanting to do it. But once you are receptive, because Steve has emphasized that the tools and the abilities to do so are there, what do young marketers need to be developing? And how do you instill that in a young marketer or in anyone in the marketing fraternity, in terms of a skill to help when it comes to interpreting data?
I think that's a great question. I mean, if I just touch on a little bit of my history, I mean, I'm giving away my age. 15 years ago, I started with a startup in South Africa that was UK-based that analyzed shopper data. And we did it within the clicks environment. And I remember coming from an advertising world and then suddenly being in this analyst-driven world and suddenly understanding how people actually shop versus how I thought they shopped in my beautiful advertising, marketing, brand world was actually quite different. Now, that doesn't mean that what we were doing was wrong. It was just, it added another layer of understanding. And I think that the two things for me is that if you're a marketer and if you've got something in front of you, my view is could data either make this thing a lot clearer or could data make it a lot richer? And I think sometimes we don't allow ourselves enough space around the richness of something. How can that paint a bigger picture? I mean, we've recently done a millennial report, shameless punt. Go to our website, you can download it. But it was really about taking this overused cliche term millennials. We did that on purpose because everybody talks about millennials, but we tend to use the global tropes in terms of how we describe them. And so we use the diversity of data. We had help from our friends at 80/20, as well as our global data team called Fluency. And we wanted to understand the South African millennial. Firstly, they're important. 50% of adults in South Africa are millennials. And, you know, sometimes I'm in meetings and everybody's so obsessed with a youth market. And we kind of have this trope. We're young and youth, and we kind of then go, the pendulum goes too much. And suddenly, well, here's this economically active, significant market. It's 50% of adults. But when you delve a little bit deeper, you start understanding things like, you know, 70% of them are single, yet the majority have a dependent in the household, be it their own or someone else's. Why do they use the internet? 70% say they go for education. Now, just to contrast that, in the UK, that's 32%. Go to a market like Brazil, which is maybe a little bit more comparable, that's 52%. So millennials are going to the internet not just for entertainment, but to actually learn stuff, to inform themselves. And, you know, if you're a marketer, now you go, what's the role of my brand? What should I be doing? Multiple dependents in the household, single income earner. You know, a brand like Takealot is going to go, what's our value proposition to that audience? Or if you're in the content space, you know, if they're hungry for education and information, not just for themselves, or maybe also their kids, what does that mean? And so I think it's about, you know, does it make it clearer? But in this instance, trying to demonstrate also, how does it make it a lot richer?
Amanda, this is quite an important piece that Robert's raising around sort of our South African context and the diversity of our data and the importance of it. I mean, we're quite lucky on this webcast to have a very proudly South African brand in the form of the Takealot Group on the call. In a lot of contexts in South Africa, where it is a global brand, we often get shoved with sort of this global insight and these global data points, and then told, okay, cool, well, this is what it is. But maybe just expand on the importance and the nuances of kind of local data and how it helps to understand a market as diverse as ours, because ours really is diverse. It's from, you know, Joburg to Cape Town's already a story. And then within Cape Town, from suburb to suburbs, a whole other story. I feel like we're quite a complicated bunch to figure out stuff about.
We are. And I mean, Robert's alluded to it with something as simple as family structures. I remember seeing something a while ago about, you know, only 20% of South Africans live in a conventional sort of nuclear family. So, you know, your ads with the mom and the dad and the, you know, 2 kids, you know, it's at best hitting 20% of the market. So I think, you know, a far bigger chunk in our market live in extended households, you know, often with grandparents or siblings or even cousins. So I think it's about that local understanding of our context, diversity in terms of, you know, every single different aspect you can imagine. We once did a project with front doors, you know, how different people's lives are. And there's sort of, I understand how it has happened, but there are sometimes some quite monolithic campaigns going out with a very, very samey one-size-fits-all. And there are some brands, I think, and I love the load shedding stuff, actually, because I think it does it quite nicely, that nail the nuance in our market. And that is why local data, because you know, data is just numbers. But what gives data that context is understanding the social construct, understanding how people live and how very varied their lives are in our context.
Mamongae, in this tenure thus far at the Takealot Group, what has surprised you the most about South Africans and how they behave in a consumer behavior context versus what you perhaps would have thought previously?
Yeah, I think not so much surprise, but rather what has been quite interesting to observe is, as much as there is diversity of behavior in terms of how people buy, there are a lot of things that are quite common. People like to get the best price product as fast as possible. People love to talk to people. So it's less about transaction, but also like when you come to customer service, what is quite interesting is how much, even in a digital world, people are happy to buy very complicated products online. But if they don't know, you know, something about the product, etc., they want to follow up with a human being. I think from a diversity point of view, what is quite interesting is the fact that sometimes we may have preconceived conditions about what people in peri-urban or rural areas would want to buy versus people that live in the suburbs. Now, fortunately, as Takealot Group, we have a national footprint and we deliver to, from suburbs to townships to villages without addresses, right? So we have quite a holistic view of the South African consumer. And what I can tell you is that South Africans all have very similar aspirations. So a household sitting in peri-urban will still also want to order that branded fridge, that the Sense TV, the Hisense TV, or the Samsung TV, similar to somebody that is in the suburbs, right? And so I think that is what has been quite exciting to see, that what we've been able to do is democratize access to like quality retail products. So those that do not have alternative shopping destinations around them or have a limited selection, when you shop on Takealot, you get the same full selection regardless of where you are. And what you see is also, like, in certain rural towns, people buying beautiful, fashionable stuff that's on Superbalist. So you really start to see that, the aspirations are the same. It is, the things that will be nuanced are more, I guess, income-led and a little bit of context. So obviously, like, if you're in a very hot area, the kind of clothing you would choose would be slightly more nuanced. But I think holistically and strategically is making sure that when you think about your consumers, you take away your own bias, because a lot of times we look at data through who we are and our experience and our paradigms, and that can be quite limiting, which is why I think it's also important when you look at interpretation of data, you also think about the diversity of perspectives that are applying their minds to that same data, so that you don't come off all just reinforcing an existing bias. So yeah, and I think that's been quite incredible, actually, to really get reinforced, see it reinforced by transactions, that the aspirations of South Africans are the same. It's usually what you can access that determines how that translates.
Robert, this is soul crushing for marketers who think they know everything. Perhaps just build on what Mamongae has been speaking about in terms of these sort of commonalities and really taking one's ego out the door when looking at these different data points.
No, absolutely. I mean, to the universal. I mean, who doesn't want an air fryer? Come now. But I think there's this lovely Michael Francis, who was the CMO of Target. He has this. He talks about, don't talk to who people are, talk to who they want to be. And I think in that there is the universal. And I think the big danger with data, and I think it is a danger to the marketing kind of teams, is that with all this data, because we can now understand everything in such exquisite detail, we now think we need to apply everything in exquisite detail. And we get caught up. And I've seen segmentations that have cost vast sums of money, but yet nobody knows what to do with it because they can't. Or if they start trying to, it's actually incredibly costly. So everybody thinks this idea of being able to target an individual is the holy grail of marketing. I have quite a contrary view. I mean, rather flippantly, I say marketing's job is to do as little as possible to build the brand and to drive the sales. And so sometimes we get caught up in highly targeted and we think that's the holy grail. Actually, if we can find more universal, if we can have empathy for universal mindsets, attitudes, context, and yes, of course, there's differences. And by the way, that's different to personalization. I think that's a very different thing. I think that's a really, really important point, to not get caught up in the romance of understanding everything and therefore doing everything in that level of detail.
So, Robert, it sounds like you're saying, why do you need data to be general? So if being specific creates complexity, then why do you need data? Why can't we just all be social scientists and apply that instead?
I mean, listen, I think for me, it's about the bringing together of those 2 points, and how do you do that? And I mean, I'll give you a really, really lovely, simple case study from FedEx in the States, where they was looking at their net promoter scores, which is sometimes also a problematic metric, but and they were constantly going down, and they couldn't understand why, because they had put so much research, technology, innovation to make the stores as efficient as possible, because who wants to spend time dropping their goods off to be couriered? And until they actually went and observed what was happening, they realized that I'm going into FedEx with something typically quite valuable, sometimes very personal, that I'm sending to someone. And they were so obsessed on doing it so quickly that people lost faith and trust that it was actually going to be cared for. And what was happening is that they were taking these parcels literally, and they would take your, granny's photo album that you're sending home, and they just put it on a pile. And that caused huge distrust. And so all they did is they built a false wall with 3 chutes for different sizes, and they took your parcel and they put it through a chute, and it made you feel like it's been taken care of. And guess what? Net promoter scores went up. Simple observation. I know it's a bit pithy and a little bit kind of, but I guess it's more to make the point. I think we balance our efforts.
Well, we have to balance our conversation. If I had to add to wish list right now, it would be for another hour, but we are in the final few minutes of our live discussion. So we're going to start closing it out with some closing remarks. And Robert, I think I'm going to come to you Stephen, I think I'm going to come to you with the first sort of closing remark, which is just kind of reminding us around these 4 Ps, emphasizing that marketing should be the mouthpiece of the customer, and then perhaps just touching on what the takeaway from this discussion should really be.
Yeah, thanks, Ari. It came up, we had a brief sort of intro conversation yesterday, I guess, just in sort of prep for today. And the thought that I was sharing was really around, and disclaimer, I'm not a marketer, I'm an actuary, so, please forgive me. But when I was at university, one of the things that I learned about marketing when I sort of sat in sort of marketing 101 or whatever it was that there's a bunch of P's that define the role of marketers. And, 4 of those key P's, I think there's more now, were, price, product, place, promotion. And in my engagements with marketers, I guess, over the years, I've almost found myself sort of questioning, whether marketing has been doing itself a disservice by emphasizing, its role in creating demand and brand awareness primarily through, promotional type of activities, rather than recognizing that, marketers actually are sort of, or should be, in my understanding, the mouthpiece of the customer. You should be understanding the voice of the customer. You should be understanding what's changing in the market, and bringing that back into the organization so that the business is able to build products that are well suited to those particular customer sets, are able to price them at a point that is not only sort of profitable, but it's also sort of attractive for the different segments that you might be attracting, that it's made available through the right channels. And I sometimes find that, when we think about, if you think about marketing's role in that light, then, some of the specific use cases around, which I liked what Mamongae, you said right at the beginning of the call, around, there needs to be specific use cases. Why are we using this data, or what's the point? Or else we just follow this exercise of trying to gather more data with no real sort of like value or purpose intent. And I think doing that in a smart way enables us, and we've seen it with some work we've done for a client. We did a segmentation, to your comment on segmentation, Robert, and it was very clear that there was a gap in the market amongst their product range. And a product was then developed specifically to meet that sort of market or segment space that was underserved. And that product's doing really well, and it's resonating well. The marketing team has been able to promote it because it speaks to a specific kind of customer. But the development of that product, the pricing of it, the positioning of it, was all sort of led by an understanding of the market, which is a marketer's role.
Yeah. A bit of a back to basics there. Mamongae, just taking some of your closing remarks in our conversation.
Yeah, so I think, I would make 3 points. One is starting off with that about asking clear questions before you approach any data. Before you even look at data, be very clear about what questions am I trying to answer, right? The second is we live in a world where there is huge amounts of data. You're going to delve deep into it and then come out and be completely confused. And so try and simplify. So once you have done all of your analysis, step back and just simplify and go back to point number one. What is the question I'm trying to answer here? And lastly is, as we have heard from this call, is you've got to triangulate data with observational insights as well as human truths. So in short, don't be a slave to data. Be slave to trying to do the best outcomes for your customer. That's fundamentally what you should become a slave to. Use data to help you get there. Thanks.
Very anecdotally, do I need an air fryer? There's so many options. Which one should I filter by in terms of price? And is the human truth here that I should be eating stuff that's a little healthier? Robert, some closing remarks from you?
You always need an air fryer.
There's just too many.
I mean, I think it, just to come back to some, I guess this at its simplest, when you're looking at something, be it a challenge, be it an opportunity, be it the strategy going forward, how can data make something much clearer? And that could help make even the question clearer or the answer clearer, but also how do we make it much richer? And I think that, to that point of triangulation, it's just eyes wide open. I think we sometimes get so narrowed and we end up down the funnel. We've kind of gone on just one or two data points. And I think eyes wide open. I think the second one for me is think full funnel. We're human beings and we're all at different stages. And when you think about full funnel planning and how we use data to inform what we should be doing and what's really driving that behavior, I think we can make better decisions. And then I think the most important thing actually is just leave room for the unexpected. Because I think once you've got all this data and all this information, as Mamongae says, it is about taking that step back, bringing other people in and saying, where could we go with this? And I think that's where the magic lies. And that's what excites me and what I love about what I get to do.
Amanda, take us home here. You speak with and have spoken to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of consumers in South Africa and various regions. There's got to be a human truth that's come through that, and there's got to be a final word on the conversation from you.
Well, I was going to say exactly the same thing as Robert in terms of remember that both on the side of the consumer themselves, they're consuming as humans. So don't see them as data. And I love the long form Apple ads are proving that people want stories. So that's on the one side. And then the same in your organization, just spewing a whole load of data across with no context. So I think earlier on you asked about the skills that marketers need. I think they need to understand the data and to brush up on how to analyze it and use Steve's wonderful tool. But I also think they need to be able to visualize it and tell stories about what that means into organizations. And that's when it will really become usable in everyday and applicable in business. Otherwise, it's just a sea of numbers, really.
Navigating through the sea of numbers to find something that's meaningful, to find something that yields some form of result. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you all for giving us more to think about. There's clearly no silver bullet when it comes to this conversation. But perhaps the important takeaway is that this is not something to be fearful of. This is something that's quite manageable, something that can empower you. And certainly if you connect with any of the individuals that have been on this webcast, you should be well poised to do so. We've been discussing unlocking the power of local data. This is a conversation brought to you by the Redzone in partnership with M&C Saatchi Group South Africa. Industry titans on this call. Mamongae Mahlare, CEO at Takealot Group, Steve Burnstone, CEO 8020, Robert Grace is the co-founder and CSO of M&C Saatchi Group South Africa, and Amanda Reekie is the founding director at ovatoyou. If you missed any of this conversation, you can catch up on demand on the Redzone platform. Otherwise, we'll see you again in another inspiring conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.